Afternoon. Are we on? Good afternoon, everyone. I think we've given you a little time to get started on your lunches, and so we'll get started on our program. My name is Beth Fortune, and I am the Interim Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs, and I want to thank you and welcome you and thank you for joining us today for our fourth federal forum, which is appropriately titled Passage of the Higher Education Act. The Feds want us to do what? First, before we get started, I do want to recognize Dean Ken Galloway for being here, Dean Dennis Hall, and Vice Chancellor Lauren Brisky. So we have a good cross-section of the community, of the Vanderbilt community here today, and I did want to recognize our leaders. These forums are hosted by the Office of Federal Relations in D.C. and are a way for them to share with us on campus some of the pressing federal issues facing higher education. Past forums, and I know many of you have attended some of our past forums, have focused on student aid, trends in federal research funding, and compliance regulations. Today's topic is again timely as the President signed the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act into law in August, and now campuses across the country are beginning to implement it. We have gathered another all-star panel here today for this forum, including Senator Lamar Alexander's key education staffer, David Cleary. We are thrilled that David is able to join us today. Over the past few years, he has been instrumental in the negotiations on the legislation and has been a true champion for higher education, just as his boss, Senator Lamar Alexander, has been. David is the staff director for Senator Alexander on the subcommittee on children and families of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. David is the principal education advisor to Senator Alexander and was primarily responsible for advising the senator on the recently reauthorized Higher Education Act. He also advised the senator on elementary and secondary education issues, including the No Child Left Behind Act and special education issues. Prior to joining the Alexander team, David served for a short time with the Aspen Institute's Commission on No Child Left Behind as the Director of Policy and Research. Before that, David worked for the House Education and Workforce Committee for Chairman John Boehner of Ohio on disability policy. David was the lead Republican staffer during the recent reauthorization of the Individual Disabilities Act, Education Act, and before that he worked at the U.S. Department of Education for several years. He received his BA and his MPA from George Washington University, and I think as you can see from his bio, he knows his education issues, so we will look forward to hearing from you, and we're just thrilled that you're here with us today, David. Joining David from Washington is Christina West, our Director of Federal Relations in our Washington office, and she will provide an overview of the legislation and some of the highlights that will probably be of most interest to everyone here in this room. She'll also share with us how Vanderbilt advocated for and often against various provisions of the bill. The Office of Federal Relations has really been intimately engaged in the reauthorization effort for the past 4 or 5 years and has worked closely with David as well as our other Washington associations, and I know several of you in this room have received numerous emails probably from Christina and her team over the years. And finally, providing a campus perspective, particularly as provisions of the bill relate to federal student aid programs, is Doug Christiansen, our Associate Provost of Enrollment and Dean of Admissions. Now, for better or worse, his office will likely be dealing with many of the effects of this legislation, although I can assure you that it will be felt, the impact of the bill will be felt across the campus. I want to emphasize that these federal forums are to start a discussion. We want to hear from you. We look forward to the conversation. We will have these 3 presentations, and then we will open it up. We've saved plenty of time for questions and discussions, and I know that there is not a shy person in this room, so we look forward to a very good and spirited discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Christina West.
Thanks, Beth. It's really great to be here, and it's really nice to see such a great turnout for this event. I'm just going to kind of go over some of the nuts and bolts of what is in and what is not in the new Higher Education Act, as well as what our office did and what the Chancellor advocated for and against as it relates to the bill. After about 5 years, 2 budget reconciliations that reauthorized student loans programs, 14 temporary extensions, and countless efforts to pass the bill, in August, the President did sign the latest reauthorization of the higher education bill. Over the last few weeks and months, you've probably started to see different provisions of what is in and what is not in the legislation. I'm going to give you a brief overview of that, and then David's going to give you more of a sense of what went into making this legislation and where we go from here. Before you get completely fed up with Congress, I think it's important to remember that as troubling as some of the provisions are in the bill, it really could have been a lot worse. Just to give you a sense of what did not make it into the bill, we avoided policies that would have permitted the federal government to regulate accreditation standards, establish price controls for college tuitions, set standards and regulations on transfer of academic credit, set federal curricula standards for teacher education programs, and required institutions to report on their endowment expenditures. Since the release of the Spellings Commission on Higher Education, the issues of assessment and accountability have really been at the fore of the reauthorization debate. There are many in Congress, fresh from their experience with No Child Left Behind, who really wanted to see the provisions and principles of No Child Left Behind applied to higher education. The university community staked its position very clearly that we would oppose any legislation that threatened an institution's ability to determine the standards by which we would be held accountable for student achievement and student learning outcomes. Accreditation really boiled down to the big issue for us. And thanks largely to the efforts of Senator Alexander and David, the bill clearly states that institutions and not accreditors set achievement measures. The Department of Education is forbidden from establishing criteria that, quote, specify, define, or prescribe the standards accreditors use in assessing an institution's success with respect to student achievement. Chancellor Zeppos wrote to Senator Alexander as negotiations were wrapping up on the final deal, and I hope that everyone got copies of both that letter and a summary of the act that the American Council on Education put together. While the Chancellor acknowledged the victory that on the accreditation language in the bill, he also expressed serious concerns and reservations with a lot of the other 1,100 pages of the final legislation. Chief among his concerns was a dramatic increase in federal intrusion and regulation, more reporting requirements, more compliance, more federal mandates. And because of this, he ultimately felt that the final agreement was not one that would benefit Vanderbilt students or higher education as a whole. If we had to pick one prevailing theme in HEA that goes along with the accountability theme, it would be the spiraling cost of college. Federal lawmakers, and I might add both presidential candidates, have begun to criticize what they see as the out-of-control tuition prices that have made post-secondary education out of reach for all but the wealthiest of Americans. So they set about to do something about reining in college costs, and this is what they came up with. There will be at least 54 new college lists on costs beginning in July of 2011. There will be lists publishing on each of 9 institutional categories, naming the top 5% of institutions with the highest tuition and fees, the top 5% of institutions with the highest net price, the top 5% of institutions with the largest increase in tuition and fees, and the top 5% of institutions with the largest percentage increase in net price. And then on the flip side, the 10% of institutions with the lowest tuition and fees, the 10% with the lowest net price, and the 10% with the lowest net price. Institutions that find themselves on the list with the largest increases in prices will then have to report to the Secretary of Education on what went into these price increases and what they intend to do to control them. There will also be a net price calculator that the Secretary of Education will develop and that institutions will have to include on their websites. There will be a multi-year tuition calculator that the Secretary of Education will develop in an attempt to help families figure out how much tuition they will have to pay in future years. There will be additional consumer information that the Department of Education will be collecting. 27 categories of information, including institutional mission, statistics on applications, admissions, enrollment, test scores, transfer students, in-state and out-of-state, racial and ethnic groups, disabled students, degrees awarded, time to completion of degrees, faculty, cost of attendance and financial aid, and campus safety information. And then there's additional requirements for public institutions related to state spending on higher education and the so-called maintenance of effort requirement for state contributions to public higher education. In addition to college cost, one of the other largest areas of concern for the chancellor was the large number of new disclosure and compliance requirements. This is just a sampling of what campuses, including Vanderbilt, will have to be reporting on. Under the Act, we must disclose publicly our transfer of credit policies, including the criteria related to transfer of credit earned at another institution. On textbook costs, beginning 2010, institutions will be required to disclose in their course schedules, to the maximum extent practicable, the ISBN number of every required and recommended textbook and supplemental materials, as well as their retail price information. Lacking accurate information about the ISBN number at the time of the course schedules are set, institutions are permitted to simply list to be determined. For lobbying, there's restrictions on how funds that we receive through the Higher Education Act cannot be spent to pay to influence or attempt to influence members of Congress or their staffs. We have to include additional reporting and disclosure requirements to certify compliance with these restrictions. Largely in response to the tragic events at Virginia Tech, the Act expands institutional reporting requirements and establishes 4 new categories of hate crimes. The Act does not contain the controversial language that you may have heard about that would require campus officials to report on an emergency within 30 minutes of its occurrence. However, there is language that does require campuses to notify the community immediately, however you may define immediately, upon the confirmation of a significant emergency, however you define what a significant emergency is. The Act requires campuses to publish annually fire safety reports, which includes information on sprinklers, fire safety drills, evacuation procedures, etc. And we have to have a missing student notification policy for all students that reside in in-house, on-campus housing and have been determined to be missing for 24 hours. In addition, Congress has included several copyright-related requirements related to the issue of peer-to-peer and illegal downloading of music files. We must have an annual disclosure to students that states that unauthorized distribution of copyrighted materials may be subject students to civil and criminal penalties. We have to describe the consequences of such violations and include our policy on peer-to-peer file sharing. Furthermore, institutions must also develop a plan to combat unauthorized distribution of copyrighted material that should consider technology-based deterrence. We also have to provide alternatives to illegal downloading. Chancellor Zeppos, in his letter to Senator Alexander, made the direct link between our efforts to control costs and the increased burden and cost of federal regulations and mandates. While Senator Alexander certainly understands this link, unfortunately many of his colleagues do not. What follows here are some of the excerpts from the remarks that Senator Alexander made on the Senate floor during consideration of the conference agreement. As you can see, we are extremely fortunate to have someone like Senator Alexander representing us. Clearly, he gets it and understands that better than most of his colleagues, the burden that these new requirements are going to have on us. It's worth a reminder that Senator Alexander's background as a former governor, university president, and secretary of education has afforded him a truly unique perspective on these issues. While his opinions are widely respected by members on both sides of the aisle, unfortunately, he's only one of 100 senators. And this is just more from Senator Alexander's remarks. I'm going to leave most of the details on the student aid provisions to Doug, since he's really the expert on that. I'll simply say that a lot of the details on the specific student aid policies were actually included in an earlier bill, the College Cost Reduction and Access Act, that was finished earlier in this past Congress. One note of a victory in this area, we did avoid the creation of iPads on steroids, or huge iPads that some of you may have heard about. The Act specifically opposes and forbids the creation of a database of individual student information. I'm also going to let Doug touch on some of these student loan sunshine provisions. Many of you may remember that last year, New York Attorney General Andrew Cuomo set out to do an investigation of what he saw as problems in the student loan industry. Again, a lot of this was addressed in earlier legislation, but HEA does codify a lot of the additional restrictions on student loans and how lenders can provide student loans to students. For the first time under this new law, the federal government will also begin to regulate the private educational lending. And this law also takes precedence over any state law. So I know that there have been some state legislation action here in Tennessee that will now have to comply with, as well as the federal regulations. In the area of teacher preparation, there are accountability and evaluation provisions here as well. Institutions that have teacher prep programs have to develop quantifiable goals for increasing the number of high-need teachers as designated by the Secretary of Education. However, the law does make clear that institutions are not required to create a new degree program or areas of concentration on any specific curricula in order to be in compliance. There's also provisions related to Title VI, which contain some of the international education programs. Before each grant cycle, the department will receive from a wide range of federal agencies recommendations regarding national need for expertise in foreign languages and world regions. Applications for funding for programs under Title VI must explain how their activities will reflect a diverse perspective and wide range of views and generate debate on world regions and international affairs. The Department of Education will assist grantees in developing a survey of students who have completed programs through Title VI to determine their postgraduate employment, education, or training. The law also bars the Department of Education from mandating, directing, or controlling higher education institutions' instructional content. This is just an assortment, a short list of various studies that the Act authorizes. It's important to note here that some of these studies originally were federal mandates that, largely through the good work of David and Senator Alexander, got modified so that instead of telling us that we have to report out payments or pay out a certain amount on our endowments, instead now we're just going to have a study on endowments. Second point on the studies is that although the Act authorizes all of these studies, it doesn't actually fund any of them. So you then have to, if you want the study to take place, go through the appropriations process, and the Secretary would have to secure funding to carry out these studies. The bill also authorizes roughly 70 new programs, depending on how you count some of them. But again, the question is, it authorizes them. It does not fund any of these programs. So while some of them may be of interest to folks at Vanderbilt, the question really becomes, one, will they be funded? And two, if they are funded, is it with new money, or are they simply taking the money from another program to fund one of these new programs? Chancellor Zeppo's concluding remarks to the senator really speak to a lot of the concerns that I think that Senator Alexander also had. Despite Senator Alexander's warnings about the implications of the bill, the final agreement passed overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate with a very strong bipartisan vote. Notably, of our 11 delegation members, 9 in the House and our 2 senators, both Senator Alexander and Senator Corker opposed the agreement. In the House, Congressman Blackburn and Congressman Duncan opposed the agreement. The other members of the House did support the final conference agreement. So what's next? Much of the bill became effective immediately upon signing into law. However, large portions of it have to go through what's called negotiated rulemaking processes, where the Department of Education will promulgate rules, and so it won't take effect until sometime next year or thereafter. So while there is some time before the entire bill becomes effective, there are steps that need to be taken sooner rather than later in anticipation of having to be in compliance with this. Now that you know the nuts and bolts, I'm going to turn it over to David and let him give you a little bit more input into how this all came about.
Good afternoon. I was glad to see that the uniformed security left the room. Just wanted to remind everybody that Senator Alexander voted no. So do not hold us responsible for everything that's in there. It's a privilege to be here at Vanderbilt. I've worked a lot with Christina and a lot of different offices here, particularly the Peabody School and Dean Benbow and her faculty. And Senator Alexander on the Education Committee. We rely on them an awful lot, and it's a shining star, a great example of the good things here at Vanderbilt. I'm going to talk for just a kind of a brief few moments, walk you through some of the things that I want to talk about. I usually prefer to do questions and answers because I figure it's better for an audience of this size to tell me what they want to hear me talk about as opposed to me just continuing to ramble on because I can talk for an awful long time if I'm given a microphone and a camera. So the higher ed reauthorization was about a 5-year process. From the last time that we reauthorized was about 10 years ago, and we started working on a reauthorization bill 5 years ago. It took us 5 years to get to where we ended up with, and from Senator Alexander's perspective and my perspective, we certainly wish that we had a much better bill to be presenting to the country. It's not a very good bill. It wasn't a very good process. It was largely Washington-driven. We didn't really think about what the country wanted, what the country needed. We didn't think about the value of higher education. We didn't think about kind of the future of higher education. We were reactive to some anecdotes, and apparently in Washington, the plural of anecdotes is data. So it's an unfortunate experience that we went through, but I think that the efforts of Senator Alexander and me working for him, we were able to make the bill, in my words, slightly less sucky. We were able to keep out some of the bad. Christina walked through some of them. I could probably spend an afternoon talking you through all the different things that we helped prevent from happening. I want to tell you a little bit about the process of how this works, since it's unusual, probably a little disheartening for people that don't live and breathe and work in Washington. In the glory days of old, senators and members of the House actually wrote legislation and sat down and negotiated the words that went in. The original Higher Education Act back in 1965, I think, was under 60 pages. The reauthorization that just amends the Higher Education Act was 1,100 pages. So it's a very different world. Senators certainly don't have time to read 1,100 pages of bill language, though I'm fortunate working for Senator Alexander. He read an awful lot of it to try and figure out what exactly it was that his colleagues and their staff were trying to foist off upon institutions of higher education. So largely these bills are negotiated by the staff. We sit in small conference rooms without windows. I'm the old guy in the room usually, 35 years old, so it's people 24 years old, 25 years old. Most of us are graduates of relatively elite institutions. There certainly wasn't anybody from a community college working on the staff, but most of us, I went to George Washington University. We had a couple Harvard alums, people with kind of outsized experiences in college and university that didn't really reflect or understand the vast diversity of the 6,000 institutions of higher education across the country. And I think that it shows in what we came up with. We met for hours, days, weeks, months, years to get this product, and quibbled and haggled over the most bizarre things. One of the things that Christina mentioned was on the no regulations on student learning. We said that the secretary can't specify, define, or prescribe. Now, if you look at a thesaurus, those are all the same word. And you would think you just need one word, but in Washington you need 3. And the reason behind that is we would sit in these rooms with staff and we'd talk with the Department of Education, and I would say, well, I don't want you to specify anything. And then the Department of Education would say, well, we can define it then. What's the difference between specify and define? Well, it's a different word, David. So then I said, okay, then you can't specify or define. And then somebody says, well, what about prescribe? That's a slightly different word. That's a slightly different meaning. Shouldn't we put that in there too? So it's easy to see how a 60-page bill becomes an 1,100-page bill in 20 or 40 years. So it's a fascinating experience. It'd almost be better for the country if we had a camera in every negotiating room and people got to see how it is that some of these bills get made. Higher education is an example. The rescue legislation for Main Street, Wall Street, however we're supposed to talk about it. another example of weird things happening in the dark of night. But ultimately, members, they're trying to do what they think is the right thing and a good thing. It's just, unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way. After 5 years of negotiations and discussions and a couple votes, we end up with an 1,100-page Higher Education Act. And Christina did a pretty good job of walking through all the different things that are in there. And when asked to boil it down to the good and the bad, it's a very short list on the good and a very long list on the bad. And I would say from Senator Alexander's perspective, the two quick answers on the good would be year-round Pell, which is good for students that are trying to accelerate their learning, trying to accelerate their degree. They can get their Pell Grant year-round and take more courses over the summer and get out of school faster and hopefully pay a little bit less tuition, hopefully get into the workforce faster, though probably right now not a great time to get into the workforce faster, but we'll see. And then the other big victory for us would be the prohibition on regulations on student learning. And the challenge on that issue, we certainly don't want to seem like we're know-nothings and that Senator Alexander is opposed to measuring institutions on student learning, but his view of higher education is based on his experience as president of UT, as a two-term governor, and somewhat as a Secretary of Education, looking out and seeing 6,000 independent institutions of higher education, regionally accredited, nationally accredited, specialty accreditors, and the process of accreditation, though probably not perfect, works by and large. Schools are accredited and go through quite a process to get accreditation. And accreditors are doing more and more every year on looking at this student learning issue. And we were faced with the experience of the secretary and her commission came out, and in an environment where they apparently didn't read any history, they apparently didn't read any of the vast number of studies or papers or things out there on what institutions of higher education were already doing. They came out and said, well, Secretary of Education should tell schools, here's a test, and if you don't pass this test, you're not going to get accredited. And we call it the No Child Left Behind-ification of higher education. And Lamar thought that was absurd. You can't take a test, a couple tests, a series of tests, and apply it to any institution of higher education and find any value to the 4 years or 5 years or 6 years or whatever that's been applied to a student. And it was preposterous. So we fought and he fought. He had to go to members personally and try and convince them. He had multiple phone calls with the Secretary of Education, and they just had very different perspectives. And fortunately, at the end of the day, he prevailed and was able to prevent this secretary and future secretaries from regulating on this. He is worried about student learning. He is worried about student achievement. He wants to make sure that institutions don't think that they now get a pass. He has challenged accreditors and institutions to really take on this challenge as they have in the past, but do a better job of communicating on this, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. So those are the two good things in 1,100 pages, and that was probably about a page and a half of language. So makes me feel really good about going to work every day. So the bad, everything else, almost. And Christina did a good job of talking about some of the things. I would say, from Senator Alexander's perspective, obviously the biggest bad is the overregulation. And he talks to, with his stature and as a senator, he's talked to presidents of universities around the country. We've met with the chancellor a few times. He and Gordon Gee were very good friends. So he understands higher education. He gets it. And he thinks that higher education is our secret weapon in this competitiveness battle with India and China and the rest of the world. If it wasn't for our institutions of higher education, we wouldn't really have much of an economy. We wouldn't have much of a very good society if we didn't have higher education. So he gets it. It's deep in his bones, the value of higher education. And he had talked with the former president of Stanford a long time ago, who told him that from their budget analysis, they spend 7 cents on every dollar on complying with federal rules and regulations, which is, maybe doesn't seem like an awful lot, but that's 7 cents that you're not spending on need-based aid. That's 7 cents that you're not spending on making textbooks cheaper. That's 7 cents that you're not spending on improving, this is probably popular, faculty salary. It's 7 cents that's spent poorly. it's not to say that the federal government doesn't have a right to ask questions about the money that we give to institutions of higher education and to students. We give an awful lot in competitive research programs, a lot of money, and then in student aid, we give money to students, and then students choose to go to schools of their choice through Pell Grants, through student loans. And I think that's an idea that Lamar really tries to push. He was talking with a senator from California, and was talking about Pell Grants, and he said, "Well, Senator, this is a voucher," which it is. We give the money to the kid, and the kid chooses to go wherever the heck they want. And this senator, a Democrat, liberal, said, "It's not a voucher; it's a Pell Grant." And just that rhetoric of a voucher is so toxic, but it really is instructive for Lamar that it's a choice that the student makes to go wherever they want to go. And the federal dollar should be regulated and should be watched, but we should watch what's appropriate with that choice. So we have lots of rights with all the billions that we spend to ask you about your financial responsibility, your fiduciary responsibility with that dollar. Is it being managed appropriately? Are you making sure that the CFO isn't running off to Barbados and investing it in his own private stock fund? But outside of that, that's really kind of where the question stops. We don't need to know about vaccination policies. We don't need to know about campus safety policies. That's not our question. That's not our role as the federal government. It really is about, is the dollar being spent well? And ultimately, through the accreditation process, is the kid learning something for that investment? So that's kind of where he comes down on this. So we get presented with some of these absurd proposals, and the challenge is, individually, they may not seem that bad, or they seem so politically popular, or they seem like if you oppose it, you're a monster. So let me give you a couple examples, and then I can move on. But my favorite is the vaccination policy. So originally, it started out as a proposal to require institutions to explain to students and to the Secretary of Education institutional policies on meningitis vaccinations, and to provide free meningitis vaccinations to all college students. So the backstory behind that is that a student in New Jersey went to college and got accidentally exposed to meningitis by their college roommate and unfortunately passed away. And that's a tragedy, and that shouldn't have happened. And the institution immediately imposed all sorts of new requirements and addressed the problem on their own, and had a great response to it. And unfortunately, still the child died. So the parents went to their congressman, and the congressman said, "Well, there should be a federal law." So he put it in the House bill, and it came over to the Senate, and we, working with Senator Alexander, we said, that's silly. We don't need a federal meningitis vaccination policy. And we tried to get it out, and we couldn't get it out, so then we said, okay, how do we make it better? So we said, first of all, we can't force schools to offer free vaccines. That's a school decision, and we're not giving them any money to do it, so it's an unfunded mandate, and we don't like unfunded mandates. So we were successful in getting that out. And then we said, well, it's not really a question about meningitis vaccinations. It's about vaccinations. So we were able to convince my colleagues and his colleagues, instead of specifying meningitis vaccination, because we could just see 2 years from now it'd be this vaccination, and in 3 years it's that vaccination, and then suddenly every school has to suddenly tell the Secretary of Education about every individual disease vaccination policy that could possibly be out there. What the Secretary of Education is going to do with this, we don't really know, but she's going to get it, or he's going to get it. It's going to be in a box on a shelf. And so we were able to successfully modify it and weaken it and water it down a little bit so that schools have to tell students about their vaccination policies. So hooray. I can see there's a direct link between that federal dollar of a Pell Grant, that federal dollar of a student loan, to vaccination policies. Other areas, and we can get into this, again, these are hard to oppose because you sound like a monster if you don't agree with it, but fire safety. So again, New Jersey, there was a tragic accident at a college dorm, and they didn't have very good sprinkler systems. They apparently didn't have a very good emergency evacuation plan, and some students died. This was several years ago. And so now we've got very intrusive, very complex, very difficult to understand rules on fire safety. I guess our perspective is Vanderbilt can figure this out. And if the state of Tennessee wants to start imposing rules and regulations on institutions in Tennessee, Tennessee should do that. But in Washington, the Secretary of Education, she doesn't, or in the future he, doesn't know anything about fire safety. They know about students, they know about education, they know about learning. They don't know anything about fire safety. But now they have to regulate on fire safety, and they have to get reports from institutions on fire safety. and it's a burden on institutions. But as you can see, it's how do you oppose fire safety? Of course, you don't want to oppose safety for these students. But so it got in there. We made it a little bit better. We made it a little bit less onerous than the original proposal. And then my other favorite example, and this is where I have to be a little bit careful in Nashville, is the piracy, the peer-to-peer file sharing. So, Senator Alexander faced with institutions of higher education saying, we can't police this, we're not the cops. And then Music Row saying, police it, they're the cops, fix this. And he struggled with it, trying to figure out how do you balance the need to make sure that our artists are getting paid for their work, and how do we make sure that we're not asking institutions of higher education to suddenly become some internet police force. We modified it, we made it a lot better than the original proposal, but it's an example of I think the know-nothingness of federal policy at times, that people come to Washington and say, well, I'm gonna fix a problem even if it's not really a Washington problem that needs to be fixed. I could go on and on and on examples, and I'm sure with questions I'll probably talk even more on some of the absurdities that are in this bill. But I want to talk a few minutes about what's next, what's the future of higher education. And Senator Alexander has asked me to really work on a plan to figure out what to do next. And he has talked a lot about the failure of communication. There is a failure of communication between higher education and Washington and the federal government, almost as big as the failure of Washington to understand higher education. And he wants to find ways to help improve that communication so that we have a better understanding of what the role and scope of higher education and what the really appropriate federal role is in the higher education conversation. He's talked with presidents of universities and encouraged them to talk to their members of Congress and really remind them of the value and the scope of what higher education offers. And often we find that members focus on Vanderbilt, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and focus on the endowment question and the cost question. And as with the 54 lists that we ended up with, there was originally going to be about 300 lists. So another great victory for me. I got it down to 54 lists. But so we put together these lists, and Vanderbilt will be on one list because it has a high tuition. There's a lot of value to a education at Vanderbilt, so it's probably pretty good. But it'll never be on the list of highest increases in tuition. It'll never be on the highest increases in net price. And so Vanderbilt's never going to get punished. It'll be on the list of the highest tuition, but you're always going to be on that list, and you're on the U.S. News and World Report with that, so it's not anything new to Vanderbilt. But the school that's number one on the list of the highest increase in sticker price and net tuition is a small little Baptist college in Missouri. And their tuition over the past 3 years went up 154%. And calling the president of that university, they added 3 new degree programs. And so they had to hire a bunch of new faculty, they had to hire a bunch of new staff, they built a couple buildings, and all the expenses that are associated with that. And you all know the costs of higher education a lot more than I do. So that's tremendously expensive. And they're a tuition, like most schools, they're a tuition-driven institution. So of course they had to raise their tuition. But now they're going to get put on a list and sanctioned by the secretary and have to do all sorts of additional reporting requirements justifying their tuition increase to the Secretary of Education. Now, if that's not absurd, I don't know what the definition of absurd is anymore. Because the secretary is going to take that and put it on a shelf, and there's going to be no value added to it. So the school is going to spend several $100,000 putting together a committee to examine their cost increases and find out why their cost increases went up, even though they already know the answer to that, and then send it to the secretary. And a victory there was that if the school was on the list for 2 years, there were going to be penalties to the school and financial penalties. They were going to have to remunerate the secretary administrative costs. We were able to keep that out. So another great victory, so that the Baptist school in Missouri doesn't get hurt. It's an absurdity, but it shows kind of the reactionary nature of unfortunately some of our politics. We get members, they see a news article about some poor parent whose kid went to Harvard and had to borrow money to go to Harvard. Don't really feel terribly sorry for somebody that has to borrow money to go to Harvard. It's a pretty good school. You're going to get a pretty good job when you graduate from Harvard. But apparently that's criminal now, or at least shocking to us. And I could go on and on and on and on. But the conversation needs to really change. And I think Senator Alexander, he's to say this delicately. He's up for re-election on Tuesday. If the voters of Tennessee decide to send him back to Washington, he will have a strong and active, valid voice on this conversation for the next 6 years. And we expect to see him, especially as a staffer who gets paid by him, I expect to see him back in Washington so that I can continue to work. But he really wants to help higher education rebuild the conversation and remind Washington the value of higher education, and then have Washington really figure out what is it that they really want out of higher education. We face a lot of challenges as a country, and you all know those as well as I do. We face competitive threats with India and China. We face a huge financial meltdown in Wall Street and Main Street. We face infrastructure problems, education problems in our K-12 systems, and we can't solve that without higher education. I see Dean Benbow is here now. We rely on their education research to tell us how to fix teaching for special education students. We rely on the business schools to tell us how to fix the regulations of Wall Street. And these things don't just happen in a vacuum. They don't just happen by mistake. Higher education builds that knowledge base for us that we can fix the problems that we've got. And Lamar gets that, and he wants to really help revitalize that. So we're going to spend the next 3 or 4 years trying to figure out what went wrong. How did we get to this place where Congress thinks it's appropriate to put an 1,100-page bill together that actually increases costs for institutions of higher education and doesn't help students out? We expect to see that one of the studies that Christina had on the list that is actually going to get funded because Senator Alexander is finding money for it is asking the National Academy of Sciences to study how much this new higher education bill costs, the cost to each institution on complying with all of these regulations. And our initial estimate, our expectation is that it's going to be, for a school like Vanderbilt, at least $3 to $4 million a year. And I think it's probably going to be higher than that. But that's when you think about all these different little silly things that we've done, your compliance office, your fire safety regulations, your missing person reports, your vaccination policies, all of these things, they come with a cost associated with it. And I was talking with some of your folks today and realizing that Vanderbilt gets about $3.5, almost $4 million in Pell Grants and campus-based aid that go to needy students. So, so that's nice. But now I've taken $3 or $4 million away from you by making you comply with all sorts of silly rules and regulations. I would much rather, Senator Alexander would much rather say, let's not have any of that. Why don't you take that $3 or $4 million, dump it into your need-based aid, and help poor kids go to college? So maybe that's oversimplifying it. Maybe that's apparently a little silly in Washington, but that's where we're at. So I think, as Senator Alexander said, we kind of stand on a precipice with higher education in Washington. Washington is, as we've seen with this higher education bill, more inclined to regulate the absurd and ignore the reality of the situation. And his goal over the next 3 or 4 years is to back us away from that precipice, back us away from regulating the silliness, dictating bizarre, and really get back to a focus of how do we help institutions of higher education get more kids into college, get them out of college with a degree, and make them productive members of society. So I will end there and look forward to questions, and I will try and be as irreverent as possible.
Well, good afternoon. Right after lunch, the third speaker, no PowerPoints. I'm in a bad spot talking about this act. Obviously, as been demonstrated or discussed both by David and Christina, they've done a wonderful job, I think, in giving us some inside analysis regarding the reauthorization. My role today, very briefly, is to elaborate on Titles 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, 10, and 11 of the Act, and discuss some of the impacts this legislation will have on Vanderbilt. We're actually going to compress some of those, so hang on, it'll be okay. I'd like to thank, first of all, Dave Moaning and Brent Tiener from the Office of Student Financial Aid, who helped put a lot of our remarks on Title IV together, and their expertise is much appreciated. Obviously, there are many changes made by the legislation that should certainly be considered positive. But there are also changes that will likely create significant new administrative burden on Vanderbilt. I thought you might be interested to hear a few of the comments regarding various policy experts have made on the new legislation. Barmak Nasiriam, Associate Executive Director of External Relations of ACRO, said, Most of this verbose legislation consists of a laundry list of bad ideas, half-thoughts, and pet peeves. Charles Miller, chair of the Commission on the Future of Higher Education, said, "The bill produced by Congress is a mishmash of new programs, new reporting requirements, and a lot of sound and fury signifying very little in the way of successful efforts to address access, affordability, or accountability." Senator Lamar Alexander said in a prepared statement, quote, "After 4 years of work, the Senate has spewed forth a well-intended contraption of unnecessary rules and regulations that waste time and money that ought to be spent on students and improving quality." The senator further stated, "It confirms my belief that the greatest threat to the quality of American higher education is not underfunding, it is overregulation. The current stack of federal rules for higher education institutions is nearly as tall as I am, and the bill more than doubles it, creating 24 new categories and 100 new reporting requirements." So with that encouraging background, let's turn our attention to some specifics of how this legislation will impact Vanderbilt. Clearly, we could spend a whole afternoon, a whole day on looking at the impacts. So I've just tried to pick a few to maybe create some discussion points. There are several areas found in the general provisions in Title I that will directly impact Vanderbilt, and I'm going to highlight 3. First, as Christina has already outlined in the general provisions, is an area identified as transparency in college tuition for consumers. In this area, the Secretary of Education is required to publish lists by institutional category dealing with such things as David outlined: institutions with the highest tuition fees for the most recent year, the highest net price, largest percentage increase, institutions with the highest net price over the most recent 3 years, and the list goes on. Impact. If Vanderbilt were to appear on any of these lists or other mandated lists, that would be published annually. Vanderbilt will then be required to submit additional information and documentation to the Secretary dealing with the reasons for the increase and steps that will be taken to reduce those costs. In addition, I am fearful, though, that some of these lists will be taken out of context and be used as marketing fodder, and in the end potentially create more confusion to the marketplace than clarity. If we are not careful, we are going to end up creating greater worries for families that may have the least knowledge base on how to interpret these lists. It is not opposition to transparency that I'm talking about, but rather how to make sure the information that is delivered is actually helping students and families in the college selection process. Second, the Secretary is required to provide substantive information, consumer information, and hundreds of data elements pertaining to each school that participates in Title IV financial aid programs. Impact. While most of this information is already collected by the U.S. Department of Education, any added or new data element will have to first be calculated and then provided by Vanderbilt to the Secretary, adding to the demands already placed on us in order to comply with existing federal reporting requirements. The bottom line, the data elements will continue to increase reporting responsibilities in an exponential manner. Third, this legislation requires that information must be provided on the cost of textbooks so that students have better and more timely access to course materials and their costs. Vanderbilt, as well as the textbook publishers, will be expected to develop and provide this information, of which both will increase the cost. Impact. As you have heard before, this means that more time and resources will have to be devoted to this report disclosure requirement, both from the textbook publishing company and the institution. All of this increased time and resources directly takes from the true education of the student and the access of the student in the classroom. As David mentioned earlier, we were meeting earlier and he mentioned that this will cost approximately, in their early estimation, $3 to $4 million added cost to comply. That is huge in this time of economic turmoil that we're dealing with, let alone if we were on not economic turmoil, if you will. Titles 3, 7, and 8 created or authorized a large number of new programs, approximately 70. If funding is subsequently appropriated for each of these new programs, there probably is something there for everyone. I mean everyone. It is important to point out that the programs that are created and authorized, but if funds are not subsequently appropriated, the programs are rendered moot, as Christina mentioned. Obviously, we will want to stay tuned to which programs will be funded. In asking David earlier in our meeting today, in typical legislation and the number of bills that actually turn into law and they have all of these extra add-ons, how many really get funded? And what was it, David? I think you said 1 or 2 type pieces out of just pages and pages of all these unfunded mandates. So it's anyone's guess how that will happen or which ones will be funded. Given the current federal, or the impact, given the current federal budget and funding and environment, as well as the recent economic news, it is hard to feel optimistic about significant new dollars being appropriated for these new programs at this juncture. As a point of reference, you know, we mentioned there are 70, and Christina already listed those up there on the chart. But, you know, some of the programs make some sense, but they're not funded. We don't know if they'll ever be funded, and it's hard to sit around and know what's the next step. So I won't go through those lists, but you ought to really try to go out online and look at that legislation and see, because there are some programs, when we're talking about the STEM fields, we're looking at, yes, partnership grants that provide support to enable partnerships for more minority youth engagement in the STEM disciplines. I mean, there's lots of good ideas here, but clearly unfunded. Title 10 of the legislation, referred to as the Private Student Loan Transparency and Improved Act of 2008, requires the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System to issue final regulations to implement amendments to the Truth in Lending Act that addresses specific subject areas such as preventing unfair and deceptive private educational lending practices, eliminating conflicts of interest, permitting borrowers of private education loans to bring a civil action, and requiring improved disclosures to borrowers of private educational loans. What's the impact of this? Well, these seem at first reading to be positive changes in terms of helping to educate and protect the borrowers of these specific kinds of funds. It is certainly possible that these changes may lead to added institutional requirements or mandates that must then be addressed on campus, thus creating increased demand for institutional resources. In addition to the increased institutional resources, the larger issue may be what is missing in the legislation. At Vanderbilt in 2007-08, 141 undergraduates borrowed approximately $2.2 million, and 64 graduate and professional students borrowed approximately $1.4 million through private alternative loan programs that were certified by Vanderbilt. And I'll explain what that means. The recent legislation does not require a lender to go through Vanderbilt to obtain a private non-federal educational loan. What's the outcome? For example, a family may take out, if they have the right credit, an educational loan for $55,000, when total cost of attendance here is $50,000, and the family only needed $40,000 after what was meant by the institution when we picked up the other side of the equation. In this example, there is no way Vanderbilt can monitor these non-federal loans because under the current legislation, educational loans are not required to be certified to the total cost of education by the specific institution, and individuals can borrow more than the total cost of attendance in non-federal loans. This may have been an area where increased regulation may have been a positive. As it stands now, when families are paying for loans, they tend to forget they borrowed more than was needed, and in the end, they're not happy with Vanderbilt rather than the lending agency down the road. Puts us in a real hard spot. In Title 11 of the legislation, it mandates formal studies on a host of topics. Due to time, I cannot go through each of these studies, and we've already seen the list from Christina on the board of some of them. But as you know, study of minority male academic achievement, study in bias of standardized testing, a report on endowments, study on regional sensitivity and the needs analysis formula, etc. What is the impact of this? In all probability, institutions will be expected to provide a very significant amount of data, information, and analysis to the federal government. As we look at some of these studies, if they are appropriated, it's not an issue of just turning in kind of name, rank, and serial number anymore. These are derived elements. These are analytical that will be at a much different level to produce than here's the number of students we have on campus today. The obvious impact on Vanderbilt is that we'll have to invest significant administrative time and the expenditure of resources to compile, produce, and submit this data. The cumulative effect will be the necessity of hiring additional staff to make this happen outside of the classroom, and more administration is not where we want to be going. Finally, on a positive note, the provisions in Title IV increased the authorized federal Pell Grant maximum for eligible students to $6,000 for academic year 09-10 and increased the authorized Pell Grant maximum by an additional $400 through academic year 2014-15, and the current Pell is a little over $4,000. What is the impact? Clearly, any additional funds to help our students is much appreciated. In addition, eligible students may now receive 2 federal Pell Grants in 1 year during a single awarded year, which in turn will allow grant recipients to accelerate, as David mentioned, their studies. What that means for us here, the impact is that a student will be able to have the summer Pell if they're eligible in the future. The appropriations for the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, or the SEOG programs, were authorized for fiscal 09 and also for each of the 5 succeeding fiscal years. It's very important to point out, though, that during 07-08, 764 Vanderbilt students received approximately $3.5 million through the Pell program and the SEOG program. In contrast, in 07-08, 2,662 Vanderbilt students with demonstrated financial need received approximately $78 million from Vanderbilt. 3.5, 78 million. That is just huge when we think about this. While the increase in gift assistance from the federal government clearly is appreciated, it is marginally helpful in our commitment to meeting full demonstrated financial need for undergraduate students. And again, that 3.5 million to the 78 million. I also need to mention, in addition to the Pell grant, obviously there is the subsidies for the federal loan programs, which is critical, particularly in our graduate program. So it's more tied than just that 3.5 million in the Pell grant. So it is not to make it too simplistic on that there's the other component. Briefly, in closing, as background information, Vanderbilt participates in the Federal Family Educational Loan Program, or the FELP program. And the FELP program loans include federal subsidized, unsubsidized loans, the Federal Parent Plus loan, and the Federal Graduate Plus loan. The new law extended the authorization for interest subsidies for the FELP program for 2 fiscal years. The interest subsidies apply to the subsidized federal Stafford Loan Program, through which more than 2,900 Vanderbilt students borrowed almost $18 million in 07-08. Also created under the new law was a new loan forgiveness program for services in areas of national need. This new loan program is for borrowers employed full-time in specified occupations or professions, if appropriated. Early childhood education, nurses, foreign language specialists, librarians, audiologists, medical specialists, physical therapists, dentists, and the list goes on and on. Again, if funds are appropriated. In total, eligible Vanderbilt students and parents borrowed more than $70 million through the FELP loan program during 07-08. And to just give you a couple of quick facts, federal subsidized Stafford loan was to 2,900 borrowers for $17 million. Federal unsubsidized Stafford loan was for 2,600 borrowers, undergraduate and graduate, for $21 million. Federal Parent Plus loan was almost $9 million, and the Federal Graduate Plus loan was almost $24 million for almost 1,000 graduate students. Prior legislation removed much of the profitability for lenders participating in the FELP program. Before this legislation, lenders provided borrower benefits that encouraged on-time payments and helped to reduce the overall cost of the loan. Unfortunately, this new legislation fails to remediate the core issue of the need for less expensive loan agreements for better benefits for the borrowers. Federal work-study program as we authorized. We have received, there are some funds in there that will be received to use in our job locator program. And currently right now, we paid out $1.5 million through the federal work-study program this year, of which almost 400,000 or 186 students were classified as community service positions, of which the vast majority were in the medical complex. And finally, the free application for federal student aid is the official application that must be completed by students and, when applicable, parents in order to receive funds. We also require the profile from the College Board. The new law includes language designated to facilitate the further simplification of the FAFSA, including a mandated elimination of 50% of the data elements currently included in the FAFSA. While we applaud this effort to simplify the FAFSA, we caution that it not become so simple that it renders it useless in determining any kind of true demonstrated need on financial aid eligibility when we look at the full asset and the full calculation of the family. As you've heard today, the Reauthorized Act is very complex. David has a very tough job. I've learned a lot today when we chatted and with Dave Moaning, and Christina has done a nice outline to help us think about it. Clearly, there are lots of issues, and we've highly simplified what's in that bill, but it is going to affect each of us very dramatically in the reporting area. And Beth's opening comments when she mentioned this will affect a lot of Doug's and Dave's shop and others, I'm here to tell you it's going to affect all of us, as she said. We're going to be calling on your doorstep for some increased data elements or what have you. You're going to be calling on our doorstep depending as this unwinds. If I think if history is any indication of how we can pull together as a team, we're going to work out just fine to make this happen. But it is complex. And with that, I think I turn it over back to Beth. Thank you.
Great. Well, Christina, David, and Doug, thanks so much. We have about 15 minutes left for questions and discussion. You should be pretty worked up by now, so let's just open it up and go right for it. And Lauren.
Yes, David, first of all, thank you for being here, and thank you to the panel. You did a great job today. So, describing this process with the staff members of Congress sitting around doing this conference, maybe the only thing that's changed over the years is that they're no longer smoke-filled, I presume? I was curious in that process as the staff is looking at these elements and as it's being debated, what's the influence that lobbying groups or lobbyists have on this particular piece of legislation? Were they absent from this process?
For those that didn't hear, is this on? Is this on? No. There we go. For those that didn't hear the question was about the influence of lobbyists. It was intense, obviously. The higher education is really the one sector of education in the country that has profit in it in different ways. So between, I guess technically Christina's a lobbyist, but she doesn't really lobby as much as she advocates to. But there are lobbyists for the for-profit industry. There are lobbyists for different advocacy groups, lobbyists for each of the different programs, the 71 new programs that were created. There are lobbyists behind each of those, and advocates for FAFSA simplification. I would argue that we made it more complicated, but advocates on the private loan industry. That was probably the biggest, most intensive lobbyist effort area in that, dealing with banking and lending industry. It was intense. We usually try and have a rule that what you say in the now not smoke-filled conference room usually stays in the conference room. And by and large, most people deal with that. But it was not infrequent for me to leave the conference, go back to my office, and have 5 calls from lobbyists saying, "I heard you just said this, and that Senator Alexander opposes this. Why would that be?" And I would just not return the calls because I don't have to. Unless they were from Tennessee. But as you can tell, I'm a little irreverent, and Lamar doesn't always know what to do with me. But I managed to produce something at the end of the day, so he likes it. But it's very intense from all different sides. From you get advocates, you get lobbyists. It was for 5 years, we were talking about the same issues, and it's a lot of money to spend on this bill.
Joel?
I think all of us could ask you about a lot of these requirements and stipulations, but I'll just pick one as an example because I'd like to know how much thinking has gone into this as far as the implications. This missing person stipulation. So I actually have two questions. One is, it seems to focus on on-campus housing if they've been missing for 24 hours. And I'd like to know maybe from you and maybe our colleagues in the Dean of Students and DUPD, what could that possibly mean in terms of enforcement when you have the average 19-year-old going off to Mardi Gras for 4 days or to see a girlfriend for 3 days? And then my second question is, does this mean anything for off-campus, and especially my area of off-campus, or off Broadway, off people who are studying abroad? Because we have lots of mechanisms to track where all of our students go, and they're supposed to file a travel plan when they travel within the region. But the average 19 or 20-year-old, we're not going to know where they are from day to day. So
Sure.
does this actually mean anything?
Unfortunately, it does. I get to say this a lot. It's a lot better after my efforts than it was before it started. The first version that was presented to us was astonishing. Basically, it would have required you to put RFID in every kid and do a little status update every 24 hours.
Yeah, that's realistic.
So what we ended up with was a lot of this is going to have to be regulated. A lot of it depends on how the department interprets the term campus. We tried to keep it to campus-based housing so that it was only for people that you actually have some physical presence of. If a kid lives in an apartment building that's a block away, we can't control
We're not
that.
responsible.
So what we what we ended up with was kind of an amorphous definition of campus that will be regulated with the other definitions of campus, and hopefully kind of more of a voluntary compliance process. What I hope has ended up is a student enters Vanderbilt, you give them the option to fill out this form. They fill out a form saying, if I'm missing for 24 hours, I want you to notify this responsible party. Then you keep that on file. So then 3 weeks later, Judy goes out on a bad trip. Never happens, right? No student ever goes out and gets drunk for a weekend. Certainly I never did that. And the roommate decides Judy's missing. So she reports to University Police Department or some type of competent authority, not just to the RA, if you, I don't know how your housing structure is set up, but not just, doesn't mention it in passing to a professor, has to go and fill out another form that the university has to create to say Judy is missing. The university then has to investigate. They have a time period to find out if they think that Judy is missing. If Judy has been missing for 24 hours, they have to notify the emergency contact and local police. It's a ridiculous proposal. It's a lot better than it started. And again, it's another example. New Jersey really was a problem with this conference. So a girl in New Jersey went missing. She went away with her boyfriend and was gone for about 2 weeks before anybody noticed because this had been a pattern of hers. And she unfortunately was killed, not by the boyfriend, by somebody else. The boyfriend was also killed, but he wasn't a college student, so we don't care about him. But she and the boyfriend were killed, and nobody really realized that they were missing until much later. So now we have a federal policy on it, and it's an absurdity. I would like to think that we've made it better. We'll see what happens with the regulatory process, but it's silly.
Christine?
As we enter into the rulemaking part of this legislation, is there any low-hanging fruit that you feel like you're going to be able to work on to help mitigate some of the legislation? And if so, what is that low-hanging fruit?
So the question is, through the regulatory process, are there any low-hanging fruits? Unfortunately, I don't think so. My experience is that the regulatory process makes things worse. Because the department, I went to one of the listening sessions at the department in Washington, and basically the audience was there saying, what Congress did that we don't like, we want you to ignore. What Congress didn't do that we want you to do, we'd like you to impose regulatorily. And the department depending on who the next administration is, unfortunately has a lot of discretion on what they can do and what they can't do. And so we'll watch it very carefully. We can, as we did with the accreditation regulations, prevent rules from going into effect if we don't like them, if we think they go too far. So the senator has ordered me to watch this very carefully and see what happens. I have put forth through him suggestions and nominations for the different committees for the negotiated rulemaking, trying to influence in a positive direction on the inside. And then as the department drafts their regulations, they have no choice but to give me advance copies, and my colleagues, and we will help them shape them, make them better to the extent that we can. Another thought that we're exploring is a new piece of legislation next year. There was a process several years ago that Buck McKeon started called FEDA to try and reduce the regulatory process, and it didn't go far enough or go very far or go anywhere. But there are some flexible authorities that the Secretary has to reduce regulations in exchange for better data on student learning. And that's an area that we're interested in exploring. We're looking at introducing some legislation in January to try and find some ways to give some individual schools some flexibility from some of the silly and absurd in exchange for more appropriate federal reporting. So we're looking at that.
Yes, Kevin?
I wanted to ask David, what do you think explains the disconnect between the way colleges and universities actually work and the way these other members of Congress must think it works, given the way this bill was written? And you said there's a failure of communication somehow in the process. I'm just wondering if you can say more about that.
Sure. The question is on the disconnect between the reality of higher education and the view of the Congress. I think it's multifaceted. You start with your members of Congress who range in age. There are members that are younger than me. I hate them. I guess that's going to get more common now. But and then there are members that remember back in the day when they went to college and worked part-time and paid for college and didn't have any debt. Tuition was $50 a credit. And in my experience in all the different facets of education that I get to work on, everybody knows about education because they've all been educated. So you can't talk to a parent in this country that doesn't know how to fix K-12 education because if it would just look like the way that I did it or it was done to me, we'd be okay. The same is true with college and university, especially in Washington, where everybody, Washington is a unique city where everybody that I come into contact with has a degree, maybe two, maybe three. There are very few members of Congress that don't have college degrees. I think there's one or two that are community college graduates. So it's an ossifying experience. Not that it's bad, but it's a different understanding. And so you get members who kind of forget about, it's been a while since they've been in college. It's been a while since they've actually talked to a university official, the president. They may talk to a disgruntled professor or an unhappy, financial aid officer or something like that, and that skews their view of higher education. You get, and like I said earlier, you get staff who they went to Harvard, Vanderbilt, Yale, and so they don't really understand what kind of the reality experience is for most of them. Don't have a lot of debt. They trust fund babies or totally merit based or need based. Don't have any loans, and so they don't understand people like me who have loans. I guess I'm not that smart, but so it shapes their experience, it shapes their understanding, and then I would say that higher education has done a bad job of working with Washington. They as a system, as a structure, they're happy for the discretionary competitive research grants. They're happy for the Pell Grant increases. They're happy for the student loans, and then the general attitude is leave us the heck alone. Don't ask us these silly questions because we in Washington don't present you with real options of real questions. If we ask you, would you rather tell us about student learning in a general sense and you tell us how you want to be measured on it, or can we ask you about vaccination policies? You all would say, ask us about student learning, ask us about these things, because we understand that. But, so Washington says, no, we'll ask about both. And we'll ask, anytime that there's a choice between, do we ask 3 questions or 10, the consensus is, let's ask 15. So it's a challenge. And this is something that Lamar and I are trying to figure out how to fix it. I think it's different for him. He doesn't really need the Chancellor of Vanderbilt to come see him in Tennessee. He gets it. But what Lamar has asked presidents of universities to do is to reach out to their members in their home state, in their district, and bring them to campus and really show them, the gritty under reality of higher education. The challenge is it'd be very easy to bring somebody here, show them the commons, and it's fabulous and it's beautiful, but think about all the costs that go into maintaining it. Think about the structure and the education system that you built around that it's harder for members to really think about. So it's a big challenge. Does that answer your question? I mean, it's a huge communication challenge that we really need to figure out how to address.
One last question, okay?
To follow up on that question, what is assuming that they're not just mendacious or willfully stupid, what was the problem or the perceived problem that was driving the legislation? The proponents, if they were asked for the elevator speech, what are the problems? What was driving it?
Well, I think the primary driver for this bill was college costs, and the overriding, the middle class concern that is out there about healthcare, education, and all of the different costs that are associated. And it's easier for a member from Iowa or a member from Vermont or a member from Connecticut to bash Vanderbilt, Harvard, Yale, their multi-billion-dollar endowments and their very expensive tuitions. And it resonates. It gets a press release. It gets a great AP story. But it's a false. I think it's a false reality of higher education. Not every school has a $3 billion endowment. There's only out of the 6,000, there's only 100 that have 500 million or more. Not every school is as selective as Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Vanderbilt. But it's a lot easier to bash the other. So this is what we do in politics. We bash the other. So we bash Harvard because it's big, it's elite, it's expensive. It's where a lot of you could argue that a lot of problems come from Harvard, and a lot of solutions come from Harvard, but a lot of problems come from Harvard. But it's easy. You're a member. Take a member from California. They don't want to bash Stanford. They want to bash Harvard because it's you don't bash your neighbor, you bash the other. And it's unfortunately the way that a lot of our politics have evolved to. We don't. I'm very fortunate. I don't want to sound like a press release or a talking point, but I'm very fortunate to work for somebody like Lamar, who is very thoughtful, who does think ahead, who does say, I'm a Republican, but there are solutions that are not mine that should be explored. Again, I don't want to sound like a press release, but you think about like his competitiveness bill. It wasn't his idea. It wasn't a Republican idea. He and Jeff Bingham, a Democrat from New York, or from New Mexico, went to the National Academy of Sciences and said, how do we compete with India and China? What are the 10 things that we need to do? They came back with 20, and we legislated it, and we put it in the law, and now we're trying to get it funded. But it wasn't, Lamar Alexander, conservative public Tennessee, gets this bill passed. It was Lamar Alexander and Jeff Bingham worked together, got it done. And that's unfortunately increasingly rare. And so we, getting back to your answer, we don't want to, most members, this is probably unfair, but it's my perspective, most members don't want to think about complex solutions. They want to talk about the easy things. So it's easier to say, we should tax endowments, and that'll solve the problem. And there are members who have said that. They said, if we force every institution with an endowment of over $500 million to make them pay out 5%, we will solve the college cost crisis. Well, that's not going to solve anything. Basically what it means is that take Harvard, they're just going to give tuition away for free to people that make parents who make $2, $3, $4, $5 million a year. I don't know that's a very good societal value, but that's what Harvard would do. Or they build another building, or they endow 15 more chairs. So it's a silly thing. But the way that our press works, the way that our politics work, it's easy. It's easier to talk about the fake, simple solution than trying to understand the difference between 30, 40 years ago when the Pell Grant was created, or when you could go to college and tuition, room and board fees were only $8,000, and you could work a part-time job and do that. And Pell Grants haven't kept up with the inflation. Student loans haven't kept up. Other grant aid hasn't kept up. But that's difficult. That's a difficult answer because you look at what we just did with the Pell Grants. We increased the maximum Pell Grant by $69 to $41.50 or $43.50 or whatever it is. And that cost us $2.7 billion. That's a lot of money. For a $69 maximum Pell Grant increase, it cost $2.7 billion. And, yes, America is a rich country, and we have different priorities, different things going on with our economy. But that's a lot of money to come up with. And then, we authorized a maximum 6,000 Pell Grant. Well, that would cost $25 billion a year, which is an awful lot of money. And where would we come up with it? And how would we do that is the question that needs to be answered. And we need to have that discussion about our priorities. But that's not easy. And so it's easier to bash Harvard. It's easier to bash Vanderbilt. And I think that, we face an election. We have a new president. The hope is, regardless of whether it's Bob Barr or Cynthia McKinney or one of the other two that are running, that that we can maybe start having some different conversations. I think there's a deepening understanding of the mess that we're in, the problems that we have, and it's my hope that somebody like Lamar can really help lead those conversations.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and we are out of time, just a little bit over. But David, thank you so much for being here from Washington today. And Doug and Christina, as always, thank you for your presentations, and thank you for coming today. And obviously, this is an issue that we will continue to hear a lot about. And I know our office will keep you informed, and we will get this done. Thanks very much, everybody.